Alright, so I'm going to do a quick talk on the scapes. So we're going to talk about nightscapes, landscapes, and cityscapes. Now, show of hands, we all love taking photos, this kind of stuff, right? Landscapes, cities at night, even the night sky. This is stuff I personally really enjoy. So I figured might as well show you guys how I go about doing stuff like this. So I'll start talking about nightscapes. Now, with nightscapes, you really have to be careful. You guys have all seen star trails before, right? So you see the stars going all the way across the sky. In order to not get that, you have to follow something called the rule of 600. So let's say you're shooting with a 24mm lens. Everybody here have a DSLR? Pretty much. All right, so let's say you're shooting with a 24mm lens. You go 600 divided by 24, and that'll give you a certain number. And that number is how long you can keep your aperture open for before getting a star trail. So I shoot with a 14mm. So 600 divided by 14, 42. I can keep my exposure open for 42 seconds. Now obviously we're keeping it open for 42 seconds. We want a tripod, right? Sound good? So the heavier the tripod, the better, especially if it's windy at night. Personally, I use the same tripod over there, the Photo Pro. What you can do is you can attach a hook onto the bottom of it, put your bag on, so that can weigh it down when you're doing 42 seconds. That way you don't get any shake. Another big thing you really want is a remote release. So I shoot Nikon. So I got this, just a little $30 button. I can hit my shutter without actually touching my camera, which is that little bit of jitter right off the bat. And that's something you really don't want, especially when you're trying to get as crisp a photo as possible. Now, also, since you're keeping your aperture open for so long, 42 seconds, you want to bring in as much light as possible. So you want to shoot at a higher ISO. So we're going about 1600 ISO with noise reduction placed on. That way it's not too noisy, but obviously 1600 ISO, it's still going to be a little bit grainy, so you're going to want to do some post-production work as well. And yeah, wide angle, wider the better. That way you can get more of the sky. You don't want to shoot with a 50mm lens, get a nice photo of a tree with a few stars in the background. Nothing really special there. And patience. There have been nights where I've been sitting out for a good 3 hours trying to get that meteor. There was one night I went to Rondo Park for the Aquarius meteor shower back in March and waited out for 5 hours, didn't see a single meteor because they never came. But, you know, it was a great night sitting on the beach getting ticks. It was good. All right, so this is one of the photos from that night. This is one of the shots. I was shooting with a 28mm at the time. I forgot my 14, but as you can see, with about a 30-second exposure, they moved a little bit, which isn't that bad. It adds a little bit to the scene. The longer you keep your exposure open for, the more stars you're going to get. So up here we have the Pleiades, which is a star cluster that dips down in April, and you don't see it again until about December. Just cool stuff like that appears. Same one from Rondo Park, waiting by the beach, trying to see those meteors. Didn't get any, but another thing you're really going to encounter, especially in areas like this, is a lot of light pollution. That's what you see in the distance. It really does hinder your photos. That's why we get the blue sky instead of black, because there's not enough darkness to really bring out those colors. If you look across, you can kind of see the Milky Way. It was just coming up at this point. It's about 10 o'clock in the at night. Now this is an example of a star trail. This is out in about near Chatham. This is a 20-minute exposure. So when you're shooting with noise reduction, it's actually about a 40-minute setup for one photo. So you shoot for 20 minutes, turn off your shutter, and then your noise reduction is going to kick in. Noise reduction takes the same amount of time, if not more, when you're to get rid of those dark frames. So what it does is it creates a black photo, and it sees all the hot pixels that comes out during that 20-minute time. It'll get rid of them and just kind of make your photo a little bit more crisp. Now, when you are doing star trails, you want to point toward the star Polaris. That's how you're going to get that center right there. That is the North Star. It's a 42nd brightest star in the sky. The easiest way to find it is to look for the Big Dipper, and then usually right across from it, you're going to find the Little Dipper, and the little dot on the bottom of the Little Dipper is your Polaris.
Ian, how long is that exposure?
That was a 20-minute exposure. Wow. Yeah, that was a cold night. Same one from that night. You can see the Milky Way galaxy in this one. And don't be afraid to put people in your photos. It really helps a lot, just making everything a little bit more human. Because if you have that human element, It makes your photos a little bit more relatable. This was actually a really fun one. I went to Virginia a while back. I went for a 4-day hike, and this was the night before I started, and the sky there was just gorgeous. This was in the middle of a little village at the top of a ski hill. So even when, like, our goal is to take pictures of the night sky, but you also want that interesting foreground. So if you can bring a foreground into it as well, it just adds another really cool element to the photo. Same one, just got a little bit of house, adding that human element. If you look up here, I don't know, that is the Andromeda galaxy, which is our closest neighbor. In about 3.2 billion years, we're actually going to collide with that galaxy, and it's going to be horrible. But we're going to love it. Also another star cluster over here, just cool things you can capture at night. As you can see, I was down in the valley for this one, so light pollution was not as bad because the mountains were covering most of it. You just got that little halo, but the sky was able to be a lot darker. We had the Milky Way peeking out right there. Over here, we have a satellite. I used the grass in the foreground just to kind of bleed out into the galaxy. Now, as you're shooting at night, the galaxy is going to move across the sky. So about 2 a.m. it's normally nice peaked in the middle. It will change throughout the year. Sometimes you won't see it at all because it's right along the horizon. One thing you really got to be careful with, people move over 42 seconds, even a tiny bit. So these guys are slightly, they're not out of focus, but they jitter. So what's highly recommended, something I wish I would have done for this photo, is to take 2 different exposures. So you take your exposure for your foreground, get that nice crisp and focus, and then you take your exposure for your background. And that'll allow you to get both things in focus. You merge them in Photoshop, simple button, nothing big. Yeah, another thing you want to work with night photography is a lot of post-production work, just because you're not going to get the photo like this right away. So these guys were actually, you can see the detail in their face. So everybody here shoot RAW. Everybody aware of the format? All right, so RAW is your best friend when shooting this kind of stuff. It allows you to mess with your highlights, your shadows, your levels, your curves, which really allows you to bring out your colors and stuff like that, which you want for night photography. All right, landscapes. Something everybody's taken a landscape photo before, right? I doubt anybody hasn't, even a simple sunset. So landscape, a rule I like to follow is you want an interesting foreground, midground, and background. So even if you put a bunch of rocks in your foreground, something to focus there, and then maybe a river in your midground, and then a skyline in your back. Just you want your photo to be not dynamic. You don't want it to be boring. Another simple thing to follow, rule of thirds. We all know about that, so maybe placing your rocks upon that 1/3, interesting stuff like that. People factor, as I mentioned earlier, you don't always want to put people in your photo, but it really does help. It makes your content a lot more relatable. And then capturing moments. So let's say you're going out to capture a thunderstorm. You're going to want to capture that lightning, right? You don't want just the bland sky. It's like, yeah, we could capture that, but if we get so much more, our photo's going to be a million times better. Now, everybody knows about golden hour, right? So that's the hour before sunset and the hour after sunrise. And this is when lighting is optimal for landscape photography. So the shadows aren't as harsh. Like if we're shooting midday, we're going to get really, really harsh shadows. That's not something we want to deal with because it's annoying and not very flattering as the photos. And most of the photos I used for this were from Virginia. I'll go into that earlier, but HDR, we all know what that is, right? Higher dynamic range. So higher dynamic range is basically taking 3 exposures and putting them together into one photo. So normally on your DSLR, you can use something called a bracketing feature. And your bracketing allows you to set it to different things, so it'll be like +2, +3, +1, +0.5. And basically it's going to take 3 shots normally. So you have your underexposed, your exposed, and then your increased. And that's going to bring out all the detail in your photo. So these are just one I took. So these were my midtones. These were my darks, my highlights, and then using normally a standard HDR program, you can torrent most of them. Like I use HDR Effects Pro 2, works just fine, and you get all your colors really brought out, and you couldn't get a photo like this just because of the situation that's going on. Now one thing you got to watch out, when you are shooting wider angle, this was shot at about 14mm, you're going to get flare spots, which is a pain in the butt. So normally what you have to do is you have to take another exposure and you take your thumb and put it right over the sun. Then you take your photo, that's going to get rid of your flare, and then in post you can just erase the hand because you've already taken your 3 other keyframes. Yeah, so just interesting stuff like that. It's also really easy to overdo HDR. Like for this one, I just brought everything up as far as I could. As you can see, the colors are really brought out. It doesn't look realistic anymore, and the sky is overexposed. It's just not a flattering picture. Now this was the normal one I took. Well, this was the normal HDR. So you still have all that detail, but it's not oversaturated and kind of fugly. So just another one, this one not HDR, this one just messing around with my highlights and shadows. You want to bring out as much detail as possible, right? So if you are shooting Lightroom, you want to bring your highlights all the way down and your shadows all the way up, because that's going to increase your detail as far as possible. And that's just what I did for this shot. There were 2 hikers going through the mountains. We were in an area called the Plunge, which right off that cliff, you can see it a little bit better in this photo. That's about a 75-foot drop right down. And actually getting some of these photos, I almost slipped off the cliff because my boots were not good enough. Thank God there were some hikers who were able to help me back up. There they are. Their names Ryan and Peter. Thank God for them. But there's that people factor, right? So where it is that this was one of my favorite photos that I took that time. Like the person isn't a huge factor in the photo, but he just adds that element, right? Like how small we are compared to that. Yeah, that's in the Blue Ridge Mountains, the Shenandoah Valley. Beautiful area if you guys ever get a chance to go there. Gas stations are like the only thing you find because nobody lives out there. Also, yeah, like I said, you want that interesting foreground, so even a simple thing as a bush, just something to draw your eye, right? Your ND filter is your neutral density filter, so it's something I find really useful for doing cityscapes. It's basically a filter you put on top of your camera, but it allows you to darken your frame, which allows you to do long exposure in midday. So you really don't want to cheap out on this, because what can happen is light gets through the cracks and then you kind of ruins your photos. Straight horizon is something you really want to focus on, so we don't want a crooked horizon in our photo unless that's what you're going for. So that's something you can easily fix with cropping, but really try and get it on right away. Tripods help for that. Even the Photo Pro tripod, which I really recommend. It has little bulbs on it, which are really useful trying to equalize everything. And a sense of size. So yeah, we want to show how big these buildings are, or maybe how small the person is, just stuff like that. UV filter is something also really useful just to help with that lens flare. Normally, you should have it on your camera anyways, just to help in case you drop your lens. I've done that. The UV filter shattered, but my lens didn't. So $130 to $1,500, it's not that bad. So I went to Ottawa last spring, just a few photos I was messing around with. I found black and white really works for winter because it allows you to bring in that detail rather than the weird slushy yellow snow that we have in Canada. Love it. Also simplicity was something that really works. This is the War Memorial in Ottawa. Now you want to use negative space can be really useful for cityscapes as well. So basically I can take this image, I can flip it around, and we'll have the exact same on each side, which is what you kind of want to picture in your head when you're trying to work with negative space. I just darken the edge a little bit to draw your eye towards the statue. Nothing incredibly special. Leading lines are another thing that's really great. So you want to lead your eye somewhere. So in this case, I wanted to show the early morning haze you had in Ottawa. So we had all the lights going and then a few shut off. It can be a lot of fun to work with just roaming around. Even Windsor, surprisingly, has some few interesting shots. So this is one of my favorite photos I took there. Just showing how cold it was. The lights were just gorgeous. That's actually a post office, if you believe it. Yeah. So panorama, we've all tried one even with our phones. Photography, when you're actually using DSLR, it's a little bit more complicated. You really want a tripod. So most of the time what you want to do is, this is about 3 shots. So you want to go a little bit near the edge of your frame, but just enough that you have room to overlap. That way your camera and the program you're using, most of the time Photoshop, is able to find that edge, and you can get the overlap without actually having to mess around too much. Just sense of size. Like we have our loader right there, right next to our background. I use the ND for this one, which gave us our glass on the water. The longer you keep your exposure open on the water, the smoother it's going to look. So if you use a 2-minute, it's going to be glass, and you can get a really nice reflection that way. Once again, leading lines, you can see it's a little bit blurry here because we had people moving. Another great thing about the ND filter is if you keep it open long enough, you can actually get rid of that blurring completely. I think it's a really nice, crisp shot. This was about 3-4 seconds, so it wasn't that long. And just special thanks to Henry's and Sangon House, I think. All right, they've been great, especially Henry's.